What up, friends? This heat is making me scream, and today we're going to be reviewing St. Vincent's newest album, All Born Screaming. This is the 7th studio album by American singer-songwriter Annie Clark, aka St. Vincent. Now, if you've been with me for a while, you might recall my review of her excellent 2021 album, Daddy's Home, an album that was a very big sidestep for her in terms of sound, but one that was really well done, I thought. It was incredibly fulfilling and introspective as well, a breath of fresh air after the more mild and okay album, Mass Seduction, that came before it. You know, Annie, ever the shapeshifter, always seems to be on the hunt for a new sound to kind of incorporate into her repertoire. This newest project goes back to her roots a little more than usual, at least compared to her last few albums, featuring the more intricate guitar work and more eclectic instrumentations that some old school fans might be more familiar with. However, while this album does do a pretty decent job at shaking things up, especially compared to her previous record, which was pulling a bit more on the nose from the sound that it was inspired by, something about this new record just isn't really clicking with me all that much. I still like the project, don't get me wrong, but the sounds, they're diverse, but in a way that almost makes the album feel unfocused. The songs are pretty cool and unique, but in ways that just don't really stick around in my brain, really. The first two songs on the project, while not bad, just don't really do much for me. In fact, they kind of embody my problems with this record as a whole, doing a pretty good job at creating a mood and an atmosphere, but just not really going anywhere with it. Spoiler alert, because I haven't reviewed it yet, but this is actually largely what I felt about the new Idols record as well, having some pretty interesting and unique sounds to it, but never really extrapolating them enough to actually create a good sense of progression and cohesion. The moody beat and jangly guitar on Hell Is Near are pretty cool, but again, the song just doesn't really do much with it. I do like those flourishes of piano that show up here and there, and the song overall does have a very sort of Pink Floyd-esque sound to it that I think is pretty interesting, but the song just kind of fizzles out as it approaches the end. Because of this, I just find it not very memorable. Reckless is largely the same as the previous track, but even more skeletal and, unfortunately, more uninteresting. Again, it does actually convey its somber tone fairly well, but I just find it kind of boring to listen to. The lyrics definitely do match the vibe, with Annie basically seeing this person on their deathbed, and the last breath of this dying person essentially goes into Annie and in turn leaves Annie breathless. I think it's a pretty cool concept, and it does fit this track, but I also find the way it's told to be a bit simplistic, a bit underwhelming maybe. Some part of me also misses the more storytelling-like direction that Annie took her lyrics on the previous record, Daddy's Home, and I feel like that style of songwriting would have really benefited a song like this. However, I will say that Annie's vocals on this track really sell it. It's really powerful, yet really delicate at the same time, really desolate at times too. I think it's a really interesting combination of vocal styles, and again, her delivery really sells the emotion that's inside of this track. It's very desperate sounding overall, and I am actually really digging the bombastic outro to this one, but I wish we had a bit more of a gradual build-up to it too. In a way, I feel like the bombastic outro kind of overshadows the rest of the track. Broken Man, however, is definitely one of the better songs on the album, having a pretty catchy vocal melody alongside an interesting combination of like pop and almost industrial-esque instrumentals. It actually, in a way, kind of reminds me of modern Nine Inch Nails, which I really like. The bass is also super slick, giving this track a sound reminiscent of like the Kills' grungy groove. The instrumental and vocals, when combined, really help create the picture that Annie is portraying in the lyrics here, with basically someone on the brink of losing it over a lost love, with Annie saying how if she doesn't stop laughing to herself over the whole ordeal, she might lose it. The next track, Flee, is another pretty cool one, though it is a bit underwhelming coming off of Broken Man. It's a bit more generic. The fuzzy riffs do help capture the sort of sultry haze as Annie describes how she'd do anything to keep this lover in her possession, but the track overall just doesn't really have much flair to it. I think the lyrics definitely do a better job than the instrumental at properly portraying how Annie is just so infatuated by this person and how she wants to keep them forever, to the point where she'd be willing to basically dip them in diamond to make sure they never leave. All this definitely does fit the vibe of the track. However, unlike Broken Man, I don't really feel or experience the typical Annie quirkiness on this track. This is mainly a problem with the instrumental though, because I do think the lyrics are pretty interesting and fun, but this one overall just doesn't feel as forward-thinking as some of the other songs on here. However, I am really digging Big Time Nothing as well, especially that gritty electro vibe that it's got going on. The fuzzy bass and snappy drum kit also help elevate this instrumental above some of the other songs on the project. The vocals are also super fun, I think, again having that Annie quirkiness alongside sounding like something along the lines of Gorillaz maybe? I'm also loving how funk-driven this track gets at times too, and that wobbly bass alongside the off-kilter guitar in the chorus. The vocals especially have this sort of like sing-song-like attitude to them that have a sarcastic undertone to them, really adding to the ethos of this track basically being fuck what they say about you, go get shit done on your own terms sort of deal. Violent Times is another great one, having a very dramatic flair to it, especially in the horns at the beginning alongside the simple yet dark drums on this track too. It's totally the sound to the intro of a James Bond-esque spy flick, and I think the vocals on this track are also really well done in creating this vibe as well. The instrumental and the vocals come together to also highlight this idea of Annie really trying to dig down and find what actually matters to her in life, especially as she looks around and sees how most people are just kind of chasing dollar signs. I think the line, "When in the ashes of Pompeii, lovers discovered an embrace for all eternity," also really showcases Annie's desperation to find people who also just crave genuine human connection. To be honest, this actually might be the best song on the album. The Power's Out is one of those tracks where I do get the vibes, and I think the lyrics are pretty good, but man, I just do not care about this instrumental at all. It just does nothing for me. It has this sort of haunting electronic sound to it, which I think does match the lyrics, basically describing how Annie is seeing this queer person jump in front of a subway to commit suicide because the discrimination was too much for them. But I feel like the song just doesn't have a culminating point in the instrumental to properly drive home these lyrics. The vocals are also alright, but like the instrumental, I feel like they often don't carry enough weight to discuss the gravity of the situation that's being described in the lyrics. And at the end of the day, I find this track just kind of comes and goes, and I feel like with the subject matter of this one, it really shouldn't feel like that. Now, if you've listened to this album and you've heard the discourse about this album, you probably saw this coming, but Sweetest Fruit is probably my least favorite track on the record. It's just one that narratively does not really work, and it's been talked about to death at this point, but the lyrics about late musician Sophie are just awkward at best and tone deaf at worst. And I feel like this is especially true over this track's instrumental. The very theatrical and off-kilter vocals and samples in this one just don't really feel appropriate when talking about Sophie's death. The lyrics and instrumentals just have this discrepancy between each other that just doesn't feel right. Now, I have not listened to Sophie's work all that much, so I don't really claim to know much about them because I don't, but that's kind of the thing. Neither does St. Vincent. She's never even met Sophie, so her describing them as her Sophie, specifically in the lyrics, just feels really weird, and it almost feels like St. Vincent is more infatuated with the idea of Sophie's death rather than the person behind the death. It's almost like St. Vincent is making a martyr out of Sophie or something like that, and I just don't feel like that's really appropriate. Now, she had a similar sounding song on Daddy's Home, Melting of the Sun, and I actually defended her on that one because in that song, I do feel like it had the nuance of St. Vincent saying that, she doesn't have it as bad as these legendary women that were persecuted in the entertainment industry in the past, and she was kind of using her platform to kind of bring their struggles and plights back into the light so people can talk about them. But this track, I feel like, just does not have that nuance. This is also because I feel like the Melting of the Sun was a commentary of sorts on how people don't really pay much attention to women's struggles unless they're comparing it to another woman's struggles. Or how, St. Vincent, as a white woman, has to be the one to bring to people's attention the plight of often, minority women and stuff like that. But this song, again, just does not have that element to it. And because of this, alongside seemingly being more infatuated about the death rather than the person, it brings this song down narratively and as a whole. I will say though that the next track, So Many Planets, is a bit of a step up, especially in that Talking Heads inspired instrumental. It's pretty weird going from some of the darker songs previously to this song, which is less of that, at least instrumentally, but I do think it's pretty interesting and fun. In fact, it seems like this one is actually pretty tongue-in-cheek, with Annie basically describing how it took her a while to find the planet where she belongs. It's also describing how she felt like her life was passing her by until she could find this place, too. I also find this track instrumentally to be a step up from the previous one, kind of doing what that one did, but better, and also with more appropriate lyrics to pair with it. That guitar solo is also really fun. I'm also really digging the combination of the very laid-back vibes going on here with a undertone of anxiety to it too. Unfortunately though, I'm not the biggest fan of the title track, the one that we end the album on. The instrumental here and its very tropical guitar and chill beat just don't really sum up the album all that well, I think. And because of this, I also find it to be less engaging than a lot of the other songs on here too. I guess I can kind of see it being a sort of light at the end of the tunnel sort of deal. However, I don't think it really pulls it off all that well, especially since the album's message and story is a bit jumbled in the track listing too. I do think the second half of this song, which definitely is more in line with the album's vibe, is better. However, it also pretty much has nothing to do with the first half of the song, so that's a bit awkward too. This album was honestly kind of hard to formulate my thoughts on. I had to delay this review a little bit, actually. There's a lot of cool elements to it, to be honest, but I just couldn't put my finger on why it wasn't gelling with me all that much. It's definitely still a pretty good record though, and I do think the combination of pop and more industrial-esque instrumentals was pretty interesting. However, I was also finding that the actual song structures just didn't really go anywhere and wasn't all that memorable at the end of the day. Again, it's kind of like how I felt about the new Idols project, where there's some really good roots to songs here, but the songs never actually end up blossoming from them. Lyrically, I also found it to be a bit of a step back from Daddy's Home. I really did like that more direct storytelling-esque vibe that she had in the lyrics on that record. And moments like the Sophie tribute on this album just show these more unfortunate sides of some of Andy's lyrical quirks at times. Again, it's not a bad record. I think it's pretty decent still. However, the jumbled narrative due to the weird track listing and the inconsistent sound and structure of the instrumentals prevent me from really getting invested in this album as much as I would have otherwise. Because of all this, I am feeling a strong 6 on this newest album by St. Vincent. Of course, you do still have to talk about album covers on this show, and this one's okay, you know? It's kind of like how I feel about the instrumentals. I do think it does have the general root of everything is on fire, but we have to kind of continue within it and pick our battles and stuff like that. I think the composition is pretty decent, you know? It's very warm in terms of its color scheme with the browns, oranges, and general fire-like colors. Her pose and sort of position in the center is also really cool, how she's kind of like dancing alone almost. She's kind of finding herself and finding her planet, if we want to relate it to the lyrics. But again, like the album, it's good, but it's just a bit unmemorable in terms of a cover too. But of course, those are just my thoughts on this newest project by St. Vincent. What did you guys think? Do you think it was kind of a return to form after you weren't feeling her last few projects? Or was this kind of an experiment that just didn't fully take hold? Let me know. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'm sure that will make you stop screaming. It'll make me stop screaming. And until the next one, farewell.